Okay, let's begin. Welcome to the second in this series of discussions. And as I said last week, really this series of discussions has two origins. One is a research project now over 10 years old, which Georgina Born and I conducted on interdisciplinarity, on the relations between the social and natural sciences. And it would be fair to say, at that time, we didn't consider animal studies at all. It did not pass our consciousness. Now, this is a good indication of how the field of animal studies, however one might name it, and its naming is a complicated issue itself, indeed the concept of the animal is a complicated issue itself, was something which was, at that time, be fair to say, and Mariam can correct me, fairly invisible in the social sciences and humanities. And the other origin of this project is an initiative which Mariam and I and Celia Lurie developed at Goldsmiths College some years previously, called at that time Centre for Study of Invention and Social Process. So it's a huge pleasure that Mariam is now here at UCL as Honorary Senior Research Fellow in Geography, and she's going to introduce the question of animal studies, but however you wish to frame it, and its interdisciplinarity.
Thank you.
Okay, over to you.
This is very much an introduction, a loose collection of thoughts. I was really pleased that Andrew invited me today, not only because interdisciplinarity is a long-standing and hugely important topic in animal studies, but also because, and this is an unresolved question for me, and I'd be interested what other people think about this, I've often wondered whether animals aren't at the constitutive heart of the division between the life sciences and everyone else. So in these few minutes, I'm just going to draw a portrait of animal studies, my portrait, not everyone will agree with this, as it might be coloured by that division between the life sciences and everyone else, and explore the role that interdisciplinarity might make in dissolving it. So I chose this next slide, because it's fun. It's not a setup. It's a picture of Monk's contribution to my efforts to work out what a lecture on domestication should be about and what readings I should include in it. And I should add that Monk has never before or since put his paw on my laptop. It just was this one lecture. So you could describe this photograph as an interdisciplinary mixed method research moment. And this was the first year that I ever wrote an animal studies module, which was in 2017. And this was the title of the first lecture of the first animal studies module I ever taught. And I reread this lecture in anticipation of this meeting today. And I realised, rereading it, that it should have been titled, Who Has the Right to Talk About Animals? Or more honestly, I could have titled it, Do I Have the Right to Talk About Animals? And that question felt even more relevant to me 3 years later, when I taught a new MA course, which included, among others, conservationists, ecologists, evolutionary biologists. In short, I was scared of the question, what is an animal? Because I didn't know where its disciplinary boundaries lay. So I did what a lot of social scientists do. I turned the first lecture into a preemptive strike. I neutralised science by historicising it. So that first lecture, I'm not going to do the lecture, but that first lecture basically started in the early modern period. And it went on to describe the long and complex process by which science ultimately came to lay claim to animals. So I talked about the exclusivity of Latin as the language of science, technologies such as the microscope, classification of plants and animals according to their intrinsic qualities rather than their symbolic or use value to humans, and so on. And Descartes, of course, was really central here. Because what's important about Descartes, I argued in this lecture, is not that he dismissed two of Aristotle's souls, the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul, or that he introduced the idea of living machines, which is quite a complex point, as Jessica Riskin in this great book points out. It's not about the reduction of life to mechanism, it's about the elevation of mechanism to life. No, it was that Descartes introduced a mechanistic view of life and at the same time posited an exception to it by retaining Aristotle's rational soul for humans. And by this gesture, as we all know, Descartes establishes the indivisibility of modern subjectivity and modern science, the bifurcation, as Whitehead would put it, of nature into subjects and objects, the knowers and the known. And that division has bounced down the centuries, informing, for example, Marx's distinction between species life and species being. So what all this means in practice is that humans know stuff. They know stuff about themselves, about other humans, and they know stuff about animals. Animals know stuff too, but what they know is assumed to be relevant only to themselves. And we take what animals know, we take what we know about animals incredibly seriously. We don't take what animals themselves know nearly as seriously, and not seriously enough for it to have any impact on our own decisions. So in the context of the Anthropocene, we might protect and save animals, but we don't usually think we have got anything to learn from them. Or to put that differently, as I did in this lecture in 2017, the authoritative status of science comes at a price. Specifically, this revolution in perception, as the historian Keith Thomas puts it, was one at the expense of the marginalisation of other ways of knowing animals. So Thomas describes, I really like this and I've used it before, but he describes an 18th century ostler who, after failing to answer a long series of questions put to him by the gentleman scientist in his charge, about the animal in his charge, replies, "Ah, sir, considering I've lived 13 years in a stable, it's surprising how little I know of a horse." And that historical marginalisation of ordinary people can be similarly identified today in the unstable working conditions and low pay of the majority of people who work with animals, but who aren't deemed professionals. So agricultural workers, dog walkers, animal trainers, groomers, volunteers in the animal sector, and so on. And it can be identified differently in the academy. The Cartesian mind-body dualism arguably scales up into a divided disciplinary landscape that's profoundly informed by human exceptionalism. So the biological sciences get the animal body, the social sciences, arts and humanities, the human mind and culture. And I'm going to complicate that distinction in a minute because that's obviously very crude, but I don't want to pass over it. So just to give you one example, when I arrived at UCL last autumn, I was invited to create a profile on the UCL website. Most of the fields are predetermined, including your subject area. And the study of animals features extensively in the sciences, and it's broken down into many different disciplines and subdisciplines. There's no mention of animal studies, however, or of animals at all within the social sciences. And this is honestly astonishing when you think about it, given, as Carrie Vale argues, that there's almost no aspect of social life that isn't built on the backs of animals. So in the end, I chose animal behaviour from the sciences list, knowing full well that this was a misrepresentation. And I could give more examples. I didn't anticipate that I would be able to give so many examples when I wrote that first lecture, but it seems to be now that I was right to be thinking about it at some level. So how do these intellectual legacies play out in practice? Over the course of 8 years teaching animals, I often had the chance to ask students why they chose my module, especially once I had started to identify a pattern. So the pattern went something like this. At the start of the term, I would get very low numbers, And then over the course of 3 weeks, the numbers would gradually creep up to the cut-off point. After 3 weeks, you had to make final decisions. I'd ask my students why this is, and the answer was always the same. I didn't want to choose this module because I thought it would be about veganism and caring. But then my friend came to the first, second, third lecture, and they said it was about animals. So if there's one thing that's true across the social sciences and the sciences, it is sadly that many researchers on both sides of the disciplinary divide have no idea that animal studies exists. And I've worked with 3 sets of scientists now who've not only expressed surprise that there is any interest in animals in the social sciences and humanities, but extreme surprise that social science and humanities researchers might actually work with animals. So I didn't talk about veganism on my courses for lots of reasons. One of them is that veganism is on the consumption side of the debate about animal agriculture. So our focus in those modules was on animals and therefore on the production side, so it included things like what's it like to be an agricultural animal, physically, emotionally, and politically. For example, as a labourer who invests or who is prevented from investing their cognitive and affective capacities in their work. But when I'm talking about animal studies, I am, of course, reifying. Animal studies or critical animal studies or animal geographies, human animal studies, let's ditch the word animals, we hate it, studies, more than human studies, more than human geographies, anthrozoology, field philosophy, philosophical ethology, and I could just go on. The point is that the field or the fields are diverse, and in each case, science is more or less relevant, and researchers within these fields navigate their relationships with science very differently. But I'd argue that if you're working in animal studies, that relationship is never not relevant. So this is Ham. It's a very famous photograph. Some people may have seen it before. It's a 4-year-old rhesus monkey who was sent into space on the 31st of January 1961. And the photograph shows Ham accepting an apple in his space couch, having been rescued by sailors after crash landing in water. And there was wide media coverage of this photograph at the time, which assumed that Ham was smiling. I first came across this book when I read Erica Fudge's book Animal, this photograph, when I read her book Animal. And as she notes there, Ham looks like he's happy to receive the reward of an apple. The reality, however, and this is the point, the reality that's established most authoritatively by scientists is that teeth-baring in primates other than humans is a gesture of aggression, fear, and intimidation. So Ham isn't smiling, he's afraid. And who wouldn't be? So as Nicholas Delon has argued, folk expertise is not necessarily better for animals than other forms of expertise. Indeed, a person who works with animals, he writes, might be especially badly positioned to interpret an animal's signals because the work itself shapes what the person pays attention to. And empirical evidence across the board supports Delon's point. But it is a rock and a hard place because scientific concepts and theories don't merely dominate, they also often constrain understandings of animals. Species, patterns of behaviour, stimulus-response models of learning, these are all concepts and theories that were developed in the late 19th, not species, but the other two, late 19th, early 20th century, and which still, a century or more later, despite the development of vastly different methodologies and technologies, continue to provide the backbone of the study of animals and science. And of course these concepts are applied to humans too, but differently. So the Anthropocene debates are exceptionally interesting in this regard. This is really an interesting moment in thinking about animal-human relations. You might consider, for example, the astonishment that's been expressed now that humans have been brought into view as a species. So Claire Colebrook, whose work I like, she's a Deleuzian theorist, can't hide her dismay when she writes that we can no longer claim that nothing prevents us from becoming anything we want to be. Or Deepesh Chakrabarti, who notes that there could be no phenomenology of us as a species. As it happens, animals have extensive experiences of the consequences that follow when humans conceive of them in this way. And rather than summarise those consequences, let's just recall that a species can't act, can't give its opinion, can't participate, can't resist, can't consent. So, what to do? I turn here to Vinciane Desprez's notion of inheritance. Her touchstone for inheriting well is the parable of the 12th camel. The slides are going to completely finish there. Can I have that back? Yes, they're done if you want to sit down. The parable of the 12th camel. So in this parable, the father leaves his three sons 11 camels to be divided as follows: half to the eldest, a quarter to the second, and a sixth to the youngest. To make it work, you'd have to chop a camel up, much as we chopped up the study of animals. When the sons go to ask the advice of a wise man, he lends them a 12th camel. With 12 camels, the division works. The eldest gets 6, the second 3, and the youngest 2, which comes to 11. The 12th camel, the one that made the division possible, is then returned to the old man. I'm thinking that we might understand this parable not solely as a metaphor for inheritance, as Desprez argued, but for interdisciplinarity. Understood thus, interdisciplinarity begins with a generous act. It involves recognising and acknowledging a legacy. But it also means contributing to it, and by that contribution, a kind of magic is wrought, the kind of magic that Vinciane Desprez happens to be particularly good at. Not merely is a solution found, but a problem is transformed. And it's very similar to Andrew Barry and Georgina Born's logic of ontology in their interdisciplinary book, which you were talking about, in which something new is produced. So I'm going to finish very, very shortly with just 2 positive notes. So first of all, the interdisciplinary promise of the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution of the 1970s had a huge impact on the study of both humans and animals. With regards to animals, it released the sciences from the grip of behaviourism and opened the door to topics that were once considered proper to the domain of the social sciences and humanities, and from which necessarily animals had been excluded. So these topics include not only consciousness and reason, culture and sociality, but also deception, awareness of time and death, emotions, intentionality, agency, beliefs, perception, attention, interpretation, meaning, aesthetics, experience, creativity, memory, morality, and humour. It's a significant shift because once you've established, for example, that an animal might have an opinion, then they're likely to have an opinion on your relationship with them. There's an opportunity here. The sciences have given a lot of thought to animals since they claim them as their own. But the social scientists have given a lot of thought to relations and about how relations play out in both qualitative and quantitative research. And then second, the interdisciplinary promise of collaborative experimentation. So I'm currently applying for funding, and if I get it, I'll be working intensively with scientists. More specifically, I'll be working with ecologists. And I chose to work with ecologists because I find ecology extremely challenging. More broadly, I find the concept of relationality challenging when it comes to animals. When I said to the head of this team of ecologists that I thought that species, the concept of species, and ecology or relationality were 2 concepts that really got in the way of understanding animals, he said, to my great surprise, that he basically agreed. So last week, Georgina Born talked about critical insiders. Clearly, the scientist I'm working with is a critical insider. But it's important to me that the non-science scholars that I'll be working with are also critical insiders, frustrated with the boundaries of their own disciplines and loath to ever serve as a corrective to another one. And the reason I'm optimistic that all of this is going to work out perfectly for me is because I believe we will have a common goal, which is to privilege animals as the real experts in the room. And that's why I included a slide of Monk's paw at the beginning of the talk. Interdisciplinary work in the context of animal studies is arguably important, really important for this reason. I think potentially it can serve as a counter to anthropocentrism, to deep-rooted anthropocentrism, which divides not only the disciplines, but also humans from all other animals.
Thanks so much, Mariam. I'm going to ask a few questions before we open it to the floor, and also people, those of you online, might want to ask questions in the chat. There's a lot of experts here. There's all the multiple kinds of experts proliferating around the study of animals. Animals are experts themselves. And then there's one of the things which struck me was your interest in the expertise of the many people, including ourselves, who are typically thought of as non-experts, but are with and in imperfect ways communicating with animals all the time.
Yeah.
And I wondered, given that imperfection and given the kind of the ostler who doesn't understand very much about the horse, what's the value, or how do you evaluate, or what's your relation to all of this kind of diverse forms of expert, non-expert knowledge, which is there?
I mean, it's a really good question. It's quite interesting how much we might want non-experts to be good with animals, and it's quite easy to fall into a kind of narcissism around that, the dog whisperer and so on, the person who has no formal training but has this kind of link with animals, which is really special. So I would, because what would be better flattery than an animal who loves you and trusts you, and especially one that you haven't coerced into doing that. So there's that dimension of non-experts. I think it's difficult to generalise because the number of non-experts are so diverse. So if you take a farm, for example, just for three examples. One would be the huge number, for example, of undocumented migrant workers and even prisoners who are forced to work in slaughterhouses and meat packing facilities. So that would be one form of non-expert of people working with animals. Then at the other end of that, you've got someone like Jocelyn Pourchare's work on the kind of utopic image of the farmer and their animals who get on extremely well, although of course there's been a lot of criticism of her work because she conceives of animals always in terms of labourers and as cooperative and fulfilling working relations, whereas it might be pointed out that in no human job does it end in death. So that's one thing. And then there's a kind of I've found a very visceral representation of non-experts in Andrea Arnold's film Cow, which is again why I chose a thing. So she made a really interesting comment when she was discussing that after her session. She said that she showed the film to the farmers, and the farmers were really interested in the film because they had never seen the cows' faces when they were doing the things that they spend most of the time doing with cows. So basically what the farmers were saying was that we're always at the back end of a cow, and what was astonishing for them was to have them to be doing that work, but through the film be able to see the faces of the cow. And that is a very interesting, in relation to the question of expertise, it's kind of interesting, expert in what, you might ask. Having said all of that there are many different types of experts, I think for me, the really important issue around not the kind of classification of non-experts is the extremely low value that is placed on animals' lives, which leads to very little regulation of people's relationships with animals. And this is true right across the board, and in fact it's true of experts as well. So for example, vets have very few courses that teach them any form of animal behaviour. So I don't know if anyone's taken an animal to a vet, but it can be quite a shocking experience where a vet is handling an animal in a way, your animal, the animal that you live with, that you have responsibility for, handling that animal in a way that you might not feel completely comfortable with, but will defer to because they're an expert. Dog trainers and behaviourists, there is no regulation of dog training and behaviourists and dog walkers in the UK, and anyone pretty much can own an animal, a dog, unless they have been banned. So I think for me, there is the issue of experts and non-experts and who is and who isn't, but another really important and big part of that has got to be the regulation of people's relations with animals. And we can learn everything we need to know in some ways about what we think about about animals from those laws, which are basically non-existent. So diminished concepts of animal welfare and so on. You compare them to, for example, laws that regulate vulnerable people, there is just simply no comparison. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question that intersects with lots of other things.
Yeah, it's a whole other field of further research, but on the other side, there's the kind of the people who are normally described as experts, who you're talking to, and the particularly kind of following on from what Georgina was saying last week about the importance of critical insiders.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about that category, or those group of people historically, because you could say that it's a phenomena of the recent past. There's a kind of growth of critical insiders, let's say, for example, climate change scientists who wish to intervene in the kind of wider political debate and so forth, and the kind of critical insiders you're talking to.
Yeah.
And then there are people concerned with the ethics of AI.
Yeah.
But another way of reading it is that there have always been critical insiders. Think of, though maybe in a different way. Think of, for example, Kathleen Lonsdale, whose building is named after on the other side of the quad is named after her, who was professor of chemistry at UCL, but also a writer on peace, science and peace, in the post-war period. And so that question is, and I'm struck by actually, there's a huge amount of effort. One could see this during COVID or in your area as well, of trying to maintain a boundary between science and culture and politics on the other hand. It's a kind of absolutely embedded in institutional processes, ethics procedures and so forth. So how do you see this kind of historical moment? Are we seeing more critical insiders, or is it rather as it always was, or is it something new?
I mean, I'm not qualified to say, obviously, across such a great big domain, but in relation to, well, I've got two thoughts. I think the Anthropocene, a climate crisis, anthropogenic crisis, is potentially a moment where a lot of those boundaries are going to break down. And it will come from the inside, critically from the inside, basically because it's a necessity. I mean, Catherine Youssef says the earth forces us, revolutionises our thinking, and in many ways she's right about that. I think that maybe the earth is going to create a revolution in thinking, and I hope that it will, in the senses that we talk about. In relation to animals, it's a really interesting point. Is it new now? In some ways, there are lots of things that point to it being new, in the sense that in science there's an orientation towards positive, very positive conception of animals, treating animals well in experiments and at home and all that kind of stuff, which leads to a kind of a soft opening up to it. But I also think that if you look at the biographies of scientists who work with animals, one of the characteristics that I've noticed quite strongly is that towards the end of their lives, they tend to abandon everything they know. So, or abandon the veracity of everything they know. So I'm thinking of Conroy Lloyd Morgan, who, of course, famously precursor to, behaviorism as it went into the 20th century. At the end of his life, he was really like, I'm not sure science is the best way to go with this. And the person who I'm working with now, when you speak to him privately, but he has published in this some things to this effect as well, he doesn't believe it anymore, and he says outright in one publication, I don't believe this anymore. I've learned these things about animals, but they're just not true. From his own experience, animals are doing things that he didn't expect. So I think in the animal sciences, perhaps, there is a history there. Whether it's been capitalised on or not, it's very difficult to be critical. I can see this now in the animal sciences because of all the institutional structures that make it much easier for example, to become an expert in a species. Funding bodies, departments, job applications, all those kinds of things, they invite. I myself, who have written a book criticising species, it has crossed my mind in this grant application, I'm not going to do this, but it's crossed my mind to lay it out in terms of species, because it would just be a lot easier.
Yeah.
So I think there's the history of animal sciences.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's true of other disciplines as well, where there is this breakdown.
There are elements of self-criticism at a
Yeah.
point. The other question I wanted to ask you was really about the kind of wider claim, because there's obviously the specific problem of how do you develop an animal-centric research project? How do you consider animals as experts and so forth? And the actual kind of the question of setting up the kind of the problem had to be researched in a good way. But thinking in a kind of broader sense, and I think it's something which we touched upon last week, was we're increasingly aware of the importance of institutions which can support us, or they can't support us, or they're fragile at the moment, increasingly fragile, but nonetheless still provide supportive environments. What can you say anything about how you might think about what kind of institution would need to exist to become a kind of animal-centric institution, which would place animals in a proper place in the institution?
Does anyone else want to answer that one? I mean, I think that anyone who's worked in an institution, and especially university, knows the near impossibility of breaking down ossified structures between departments and so on. I think what UCL Anthropocene are doing in foregrounding the value of interdisciplinarity is really important, and there have to be channels and programs and funding bodies and so on that support that in order to make it possible. In relation to animals, I mean, part of the reason why I resist going there is twofold. One is that it would require a revolution in perception again, as so Keith Thomas says, we have a revolution in perception in the early modern period with the birth of modern science. We would have to have another revolution in perception, I think. And the reason I say that is because our labour, our wages, our labour is cheap. And the reason it's cheap is because of animal food production. It's because of the cheap cost of producing meat. And universities, so that's just generally applicable to everybody, but with regards to universities specifically, universities 100 billion animals per year in the research community, in the medical research community. You know, so what Slaughter calls academic capitalism, you know, it's built, a lot of the money that universities generate is through this research on animals that we don't see and we don't talk about it, just like we don't see and we don't talk about the animals who are on the roads in lorries, but we don't actually see them. So it's very difficult to imagine a transformed university within a context where those things are possible. You know, to do it, it would be a schizophrenic kind of relationship to it. But obviously, I think at a less dramatic, less revolutionary level, interdisciplinarity has got to be. There is just no question in my mind that animal studies and the study of animals has got to be interdisciplinary. I don't have any doubt about that. And universities like to keep the disciplines apart. Funders like to keep the disciplines apart. We all know this. And animal studies in the social sciences and humanities really exposes that, I think, in a way that other subjects perhaps don't, because it's a very high-risk subject to choose to study. When you strip away the science from animal studies, you are left with the value of animals in society, and then you've got no money you've got no job. You can't fill in a form, you can't say what your research profile is. So I think, students won't sit it, PhD students won't do it, and they're right, this is a very high-risk decision to make. So I really think animal studies, and it also, of course, it's without science, it often has been characterised as feminized, as Rhoda Wilkes says, feminized and childlike. So I think animal studies really exposes the value of animals socially and culturally in a way that it's hidden in the scientific disciplines by the prestige of science. So yeah, that's not really an answer. It's very negative, very bleak, very bleak response.
Maybe we should. I should invite questions from the floor and also